As President Trump's motorcade moves through the streets of Beijing this week, the atmosphere is heavy with the realization that the traditional rules of the global economic game have effectively collapsed. We are witnessing a diplomatic high-wire act that is as much about managing a messy divorce as it is about finding new terms for coexistence. Based on current data, this summit between President Trump and President Xi Jinping isn't just another round of trade talks. It is a critical pivot point where two distinct visions of the future are clashing in real time. On one side, we have a U.S. administration attempting to regain its footing after significant judicial setbacks to its tariff policy. And on the other, a Chinese leadership that has spent the last year legally and technologically insulating itself from Western pressure. Why would 17 of the most powerful CEOs in America, including Tim Cook, Elon Musk, and Kelly Ortberg, choose this exact moment to fly into the heart of the Chinese capital? Their presence suggests a profound tension between corporate necessity and national strategy. While Washington discusses decoupling, these executives are managing supply chains that remain deeply intertwined with Chinese manufacturing. This raises an important question. Can a government-to-government board of trade actually stabilize a relationship when the underlying technology and energy sectors are moving toward a permanent fracture? To understand the stakes, we have to look back at the events of this past April. While the headlines were focused on domestic issues, China quietly instituted new regulations for industrial and supply chain security. These aren't just administrative updates, they are the legal foundation for China to launch countermeasures against foreign government restrictions. This reflects what analysts describe as an era of economic lawfare. Instead of just reacting to U.S. crossing sanctions, Beijing is now building a domestic legal framework to legitimize its own retaliation. Think of it like this. If the last 5 years were characterized by a series of opportunistic skirmishes, we have now entered a phase of codified, structural competition. This shift is most visible in the semiconductor industry. According to recent reporting, a Chinese startup called DeepSeek recently released an AI model specifically optimized for Huawei chips, rather than the US origin hardware that has dominated the field for decades. This is a significant development because it proves that export controls have acted as an unintended subsidy for Chinese domestic innovation. In 2023, NVIDIA held over 90% of the AI chip market in China. By 2025, domestic Chinese chips had captured 41% of that same market. This leads to a striking pattern recognition insight. By restricting access to the world's best chips, the US may have inadvertently forced the creation of a viable, independent Chinese tech ecosystem that no longer requires American architecture. As this technological divide grows, the legislative branch in Washington is moving to tighten the net even further. The proposed Match Act aims to close the remaining export control loopholes on semiconductor manufacturing tools, essentially trying to plug the leaks in a ship that is already taking on water. But this raises a curiosity gap. If the U-Court successfully cuts off the remaining tools, does China have a kill switch of its own? Analysts suggest that China's dominance in rare earth processing remains its most potent form of structural leverage. While Beijing has been relatively restrained so far, its new supply chain laws provide the legal green light to choke off the materials required for American high-tech manufacturing at a moment's notice. The timing of this summit is further complicated by a massive disruption in global energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed due to the ongoing conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, with Brent crude rising nearly 3% to $104.21 per barrel. The economic pressure on the American consumer is reaching a breaking point. It's a classic case of a geopolitical shock meeting a fragile domestic economy. While the S&P 500 has managed to touch all-time highs on the back of AI profits, the broader economy is feeling the weight. Transportation and logistics sectors are absorbing heavy hits, with Southwest Airlines and Royal Caribbean seeing notable stock declines. This creates a fascinating contrast in how the two superpowers view the same crisis. For the U.S. administration, $100 oil is a political and economic nightmare that threatens domestic stability and complicates the federal debt, which currently stands at roughly $1 trillion. However, for Beijing, this exact energy price spike can be viewed as a strategic advantage. High oil prices accelerate the global transition to electric vehicles and solar power sectors where China already holds a commanding lead in manufacturing and supply chain control. This suggests that while Washington is focused on restoring the status quo in the Middle East, Beijing may be viewing the disruption as a catalyst for its own green tech dominance. The domestic legal landscape in the United States has also shifted the administration's strategy. Recent rulings by the Supreme Court and federal courts have invalidated the sweeping 145% tariffs that were a cornerstone of the administration's trade policy. This judicial roadblock has effectively stripped the executive branch of its primary economic weapon. According to multiple sources, this is why we are seeing a shift toward the proposed Board of Trade. If you can't use tariffs to force a deal because the courts won't allow it, you have to create a new government-to-government framework to exert influence. It is a pivot from unilateral force to a more complex form of institutionalized leverage. But how do you find common ground when the trade data shows such a stark divergence? Last year, the US-China trade imbalance was $202 billion, and China's share of US imports dropped to just 7.5% in the first quarter of 2026. This isn't just a dip, it is evidence of a structural decoupling that is already well underway. On the American side, the narrative of lowering the cost of goods through trade is increasingly being viewed as a relic of the past. As economics professor Brian Bethune noted, many consumers feel like they were treading water with their nose just above the surface, and the current combination of inflation and trade friction is pulling them under. The presence of those 17 CEOs in Beijing adds a layer of corporate diplomacy that might actually be at odds with the goals of the Match Act. Take Apple or Tesla, for instance. These companies aren't just looking for cheap labor. They are looking for a massive consumer market that is increasingly turning toward domestic brands. If the US government pushes for harder tech restrictions, it risks putting these American champions in an impossible position where they are forced to choose between their home government security priorities and their own commercial survival. This highlights a fundamental contradiction. Washington is trying to win a tech war using companies that are still deeply dependent on the enemy's infrastructure. This brings us to the most immediate geopolitical tension hanging over the summit: the U.S. rejection of Iran's ceasefire proposal. President Trump's statement that the agreement is on life support indicates a preference for continued strategic positioning over a quick resolution. This has a direct impact on the Beijing talks. China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil, which gives Beijing a unique form of leverage over Tehran. The question that remains unanswered is whether the U.S. will try to trade concessions on tech exports or tariffs in exchange for China using its influence to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It's a high-stakes swap, energy security for technological supremacy. However, the limits of US-1 leverage are becoming more apparent. With a $19 trillion federal debt, the capacity for the U.S. to subsidize a domestic rare earth industry or a completely independent chip supply chain is constrained. You can't simply spend your way out of a dependency that took 30 years to build, especially when your borrowing costs are rising. This makes the negotiation in Beijing less about winning and more about managing the rate of decline in the old relationship. This doesn't necessarily mean a total collapse of ties is imminent, but it does suggest that both nations are preparing for a future where they no longer rely on each other for their core national interests. Based on the available data, the Board of Trade proposal might be the last attempt to create a structured safety net for this relationship. If it fails to provide a mechanism for dispute resolution that satisfies both the U.S. national security establishment and the Chinese Communist Party's desire for supply chain security, the decoupling will move from a policy choice to an unstoppable economic reality. We are looking at two giants trying to agree on the terms of their separation, while the house they both live in is increasingly under pressure from external energy shocks and internal judicial challenges. As the first day of meetings concludes, the primary takeaway is the sheer scale of the disconnect between the diplomatic rhetoric and the macroeconomic facts on the ground. While the talk in the room focuses on agricultural purchases and stabilization, the legislation being drafted in Washington and the regulations being signed in Beijing tell a different story. It is a story of two systems that are no longer compatible, searching for a way to stay in the same room without causing a global systemic failure. But with the Match Act looming and China's domestic AI ecosystem rapidly maturing, the window for a meaningful truce is closing. This leaves us with one of the most critical questions of our time. Can these two nations manage a structural decoupling without triggering a broader conflict that neither side's economy is truly prepared to handle? As we look past the immediate diplomatic theater in Beijing, we have to ask a more fundamental question. Is it even possible to de-escalate a competition that has become so deeply encoded into the laws and hardware of both nations? Based on current data, the Board of Trade concept being discussed at the summit isn't just a creative diplomatic tool, it's a necessary pivot born out of domestic legal constraints. When the U.S. Supreme Court and federal courts invalidated the administration's sweeping 145% tariffs, they essentially took the primary weapon of executive trade policy off the table. This forced a strategic shift from unilateral action to a government-to-government framework. Think of it like a professional sports league that suddenly loses its ability to levy fines. The only way to maintain order is to create a new shared governing board that all parties agree to follow. But this shift toward institutionalized negotiation happens exactly as the technological foundations of both countries are drifting apart. According to recent reporting, the U.S. Congress is currently moving forward with the Match Act, which aims to close remaining loopholes in semiconductor tool exports. At the same time, China's April 2026 regulations for industrial and supply chain security have created a mirror image legal structure. This raises an important question. Can a joint board of trade actually function if both sides are simultaneously passing laws designed to exclude the other? We are moving into an era of economic lawfare, where trade isn't just governed by market demand, but by a complex web of national security statutes that make every transaction a potential legal liability. This technological rift is perhaps best illustrated by the emergence of the DeepSeek AI model, which was specifically optimized for Huawei's domestic chips. This represents a massive pattern recognition insight for anyone following the semiconductor industry. For years, the prevailing wisdom was that U.S. export controls would starve Chinese AI development by cutting off access to high-end NVIDIA hardware. However, the data shows that this starvation actually acted as a catalyst for a domestic ecosystem. Prior to 2023, NVIDIA held over 90% of the market in China. By 2025, domestic Chinese chips had captured 41%. This suggests that the U.S. containment strategy may have inadvertently solved the chicken and egg problem for Chinese hardware manufacturers by giving domestic developers no choice but to optimize for local chips. The presence of 17 major U.S. CEOs in Beijing, including those leading Apple and Tesla, highlights the massive friction between this decoupling policy and corporate reality. For these executives, the Chinese market isn't just a line item, it is a critical pillar of their global manufacturing and consumer base. This creates a curiosity gap. Are these CEOs in Beijing to support the administration's goals, or are they there to lobby for carve-outs that would protect their specific supply chains from the Match Act? If the U.S. government decides to fully restrict the tools needed to build advanced chips in China, it doesn't just hurt Chinese firms, it risks making the manufacturing bases of companies like Apple and Tesla obsolete overnight. This corporate tension is playing out against a macroeconomic backdrop that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. While the S&P 500 is touching all-time highs, largely driven by the AI boom, the average consumer is experiencing a very different reality. Economics professor Brian Bethune points out that many are treading water with inflation, and the current projected 3.7% year-over-year CPI increase is pulling them under. This raises a critical contrast. On one hand, you have the financial markets celebrating record corporate profits. On the other, you have a consumer affordability crisis that is straining the political capital of the administration. This suggests that the stock market is no longer a reliable barometer for the health of the average American household, particularly as transportation and logistics sectors absorb the costs of high energy prices. Speaking of energy, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has created one of the most significant strategic disparities between the two nations. In the West, the closure is framed almost exclusively as a supply shock crisis that is driving up the price of Brent crude to over 104 times to $104 and causing domestic political headaches for the U.S. administration. However, according to geopolitical analysts, Beijing may view this same crisis through a very different lens. Because China has invested so heavily in electric vehicles and solar infrastructure, sustained high oil prices actually accelerate the global shift toward the very sectors China dominates. Think of it like this. If you own the world's biggest factory for umbrellas, a long-term forecast of rain isn't a crisis, it's a market opportunity. This reveals a deeper pattern. Beijing's green tech strategy isn't just about the environment. It's a form of energy security insulation that makes it more resilient to Middle Eastern volatility than the United States. This leads us to a difficult conversation regarding fiscal constraints. The U.S. federal debt now stands at approximately $1.9 trillion. While that number is often discussed in abstract terms, it has very real implications for how the U.S. competes with China. For example, if the U.S. wants to break its reliance on Chinese rare earth processing, it needs to subsidize a massive multi-year build-out of domestic refining capacity. However, a $1.9 trillion debt limit makes that kind of industrial policy extremely difficult to fund. This creates an inference. China's current restraint in weaponizing its rare earth dominance might be temporary. By passing its supply chain security laws in April, Beijing has already laid the legal groundwork to choke off exports if Washington pushes too hard with the Match Act. They are essentially waiting to see if the USB attempts to finish the tech war before they deploy their most powerful economic countermeasure. The role of Iran in this summit adds another layer of complexity. President Trump's rejection of the latest ceasefire proposal suggests a long-term commitment to strategic pressure. But this pressure has a cost that is paid in oil prices. China, as the primary buyer of Iranian crude, effectively holds the keys to Iran's economic survival. This raises an intriguing scenario. Could the U.S. offer to soften its stance on certain tech exports in exchange for China pressuring Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? It would be a classic guns for butter trade, but it would require both sides to trust that the other will actually follow through, a tall order given the current climate of economic lawfare. We also have to consider the limits of what a board of trade can actually achieve. If the board is established but fails to resolve a major dispute, such as a Chinese retaliation against the Match Act, what enforcement mechanisms are left? Because the federal courts have established a precedent against unilateral tariff hikes, the administration may find itself in a position where it has plenty of rhetoric but very few legal tools to back it up. This suggests that the power in the US-China relationship is shifting from the executive branch to the legislative and judicial branches, creating a more fragmented and unpredictable foreign policy. Based on current data, the unilateral era of trade policy may be over, replaced by a period where the administration has to navigate a minefield of domestic legal challenges and international supply chain dependencies. The structural decoupling is even showing up in the energy trade statistics. US LNG exports to China plummeted from over 4 million tons in 2024 to just 26,000 tons in 2025. That is a collapse of nearly 99% in just 1 year. When you see a drop that dramatic, it's not just a market fluctuation, it's a sign that the two economies are physically detaching their vital infrastructure from one another. This decoupling is often framed as a strategic choice by Washington, but the data suggests it is increasingly a choice by Beijing as well. By shifting away from US energy and toward domestic green tech and Iranian oil, China is systematically reducing the surface area that the US can target with sanctions. As the Beijing summit continues, the central tension remains. Can these two nations maintain a managed competition while their underlying systems are becoming fundamentally incompatible? The corporate world, represented by those 17 CEOs, is desperate for a return to the status quo of the early 2020s. But the geopolitical and legislative reality, the Match Act, the supply chain security laws, and the $104 oil suggests that the old status quo is gone for good. We are seeing a move toward a two-world system, one centered on US hardware and financial systems, and another centered on Chinese hardware and green energy dominance. Ultimately, the success of this summit won't be measured by the size of a new agricultural purchase agreement or a joint statement on stability. It will be measured by whether both sides can agree on a set of rules for their divorce. The $202 billion trade imbalance and the rise of domestic Chinese AI chips suggest that the divorce is already well underway. The goal now is to prevent that separation from turning into a systemic global failure. But with the US facing a fiscal wall and China building a legal fortress around its supply chains, the space for compromise is shrinking. What we are witnessing is the birth of a new kind of superpower rivalry, one that isn't fought just with military hardware, but with chip architectures, rare earth processing, and specialized legal regulations. As this week's talks conclude, the most important takeaway might be that the era of globalization as we knew it has been replaced by a much more cautious and codified form of strategic coexistence. The question isn't whether the US and China will decouple, the data shows they already are, but whether they can do so without breaking the global economy in the process. The path forward is no longer about integration, it's about managing the friction of two giants moving in opposite directions.